There's a quote about Cory Bush, and
Or
the quote says something to the effect of, "Many of us do not choose to become activists, we are activated." And so there's a longer quote, but that's how it starts. Like, many of us do not choose to become activists, we are activated. What were some things that activated you? I know you mentioned you had that awakening in 2020, and I've talked to people about this too. The shifts that have happened, like only for you, hey, you saying, hey, it hasn't changed for me the way it has some of these other organizations. And I've talked to folks about that, had the sentiments of, hey, there was a period where folks were saying we need to read all the books, we need to do better. And now it's like we need to ban the books, we need to stop talking about this history. And so this recognition that not all of us choose activism, but we're activated. I'm wondering if there are some things you can share around what activated you.
I feel like I have a few chapters of awakening. Like
Okay.
they happen very. Oh, I think the first was 2016, or I shouldn't say 2016. I think it was like 20 when the actual primaries for the presidential race were happening. A few people might not remember this because who remembers where debates and things happen? My alma mater, the place that I am currently an adjunct professor for, they hosted the DNC. So I got to see Bernie Sanders, I got to see Hillary Clinton, and I forgot the third. Again, no intentional shade. For me, listening to Bernie Sanders, very radical, very self described democratic socialist. When I started thinking a little bit more about other people and the impacts that our decisions have on other people, and that we don't necessarily exist in a vacuum, and that the policies and things that we push and the narratives that we push need to be inclusive of other people. So I started getting a little more intentional about getting involved in the politics. When 2016 hit and the election was over, oh, I don't think I have stopped watching the news that day.
Okay.
I I fear the idea of being undereducated, especially when it comes to our safety, our social well-being, our cultural well-being, and mix that in with the other kind of moments of awakening that I had. Um, I understood that one of the things that I have to do is to continue to push other people to be a little more empathetic in the way that they navigate different spaces. So when I go into classrooms, for instance, because I mentioned that I am an adjunct professor, which is another part of this awakening,
Okay.
I've mantled the ideas that surround design because, like everything else, it's very ethnocentric, it's very white centered. And even the ways that we talk about design are very white centered. And I want to be intentional about, and I have tried to be intentional about getting my students to think outside of the normative mindset. How do we dismantle? How do we recalibrate these stories that have been told? How do we give different perspectives? How do we make sure that we're tapping on those experts and not just considering them as the target audience, but really experts in their lived experience? And how do we speak to that? The thing that activated me as a citizen designer has to be my involvement in politics, my attention to politics. Um, Many people have this idea, but if you don't watch the news like daily, um, you have this idea that the world around us is toxic. But when you're watching the news and when you're paying attention to politics, it is extremely toxic. And seeing that toxicity, seeing the selfishness that some of our politicians are exuding, but then seeing those politicians like Cory Bush, like AOC, like Jamal Bowman, you get a little, I think you get inspired to do a little more. I can't not mention Bernie Sanders again because, that was the OG for me. I think understanding that there are other people out there and those people need to be attended to and their needs need to be attended to. That's how I think about design. And that's the space that awakened that for me. And when I got into grad school, I started really solidifying what my values are not just as a designer, but as a person, as an activist.
Could you say a little bit more about what some of those values are? Not exhaustive, but what are some of those values that come to mind? You got the grass cutter, you started solidifying some of those. Say a little bit more about that.
I've literally solidified them because my capstone project was a manifesto, and the values that I put in there, or they're not necessarily values, they're pillars of how to reimagine design education, but they are also things that I value, like radical empathy, radical storytelling, radical self-love. And that first one to me is the most important. There is, can't remember her credentials, so forgive me, but her name is Dr. Jennifer Nash. She talks about the Black love politics, I believe it's officially called. But it's this idea that intersectionality is overused and cheapened by the way that it's overused. And really, we need to get to a space where we are loving who we are radically. We need to really lean into who we are, understand what makes us, and then understand that our individual identities are not the same as other people. Even if we share different identities, different people's experiences inform who they are. And the more that you are intentional about loving yourself, the more that you understand that concept of different. And that concept of difference is not necessarily a bad thing. She argues that it helps you to reinforce this idea of empathy. And that for me is really important. So radical self-love is my first value. The radical empathy, I think, comes right afterwards. Radical authorship, I don't think I said that, but the ability to tell your own story. The normative way of thinking and the normative way of being are not necessarily your reality, and that's okay. You can tell the story and live the story however you wish.
So self-love, empathy,
Yeah.
radical authorship. All right.
Take control
Okay.
of your own story, of your own narratives.